to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
As folks come in, I'll get started. I want to welcome you and wish you a good afternoon. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. The center has organized and convened today's program. I want to first welcome you to participate. You'll see at the bottom of the screen is a Q&A button. That is your way to give us great questions. Questions can be, please explore this area, or raise challenges to the direction of the conversation. We love good questions. Welcome and thank you for joining today's program, The Power of Athletes. I want to first introduce Dave Zirin, who is the author of 10 books on the politics of sports, most recently, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. It's gotten quite a bit of attention. Mr. Zirin has been on ESPN, MSNBC. He hosts the nation's Edge of Sports podcast, and you'll see his name pretty frequently. Moderating today's conversation is Doug Hartmann, who is a professor of sociology here at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of Midnight Basketball, Race, Sports, and Neoliberal Social Policy, as well as Race, Culture, and the Revolt of the Black Athlete. He too has had quite a bit of media attention, including on CBS This Morning, BBC, and HBO's Level Playing Field. Doug Hartmann, take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Jacobs. Thanks everybody for joining us as well. It's exciting to see so many folks here, anxious to talk about and hear about athletes and activism and sport and politics, something Dave Zirin and I have interacted with once in a while, and now have an amazing opportunity to do more of that today. I'm really excited to be joined here by Dave to really focus on, and what's bringing us together is really the new book, The Kaepernick Effect, based on interviews with athletes and allies and supporters all across the American sporting landscape that took a knee after Colin Kaepernick led the way in 2016. It's amazing reporting, incredible storytelling, and a subtle and sophisticated underlying framework to think about not just why people did it, but the larger effects that has had in our sports world and in society more broadly. The plan for today is to talk a little bit about the origins and inspiration of the project. Then I'm hoping to get in some conversation with Dave to try to pull out some of the many underlying embedded insights and ideas about athlete activism, about social movements, about social change and politics that are embedded in the project. And in the context of all that, put this project and the activist athlete movement that we see in some broader historical and social context with respect to politics and sport and social changes, which are the theme of many of the activities and events that this center tries to sponsor and support. So welcome, Dave. Great to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I know we had hoped this was going to be in person at one time, but the pandemic reared its head. So I'm actually glad we can at least have this happen. And even thinking it might help us get a little bit larger audience with the Zoom format, not just in Minnesota, but all around. So hope you're ready for all that.
I'm ready.
All right. I want to start just with a general question. I'm sure a lot of people are asking about it, but can you talk a little bit about the origins and inspiration of this most recent book and project?
Absolutely. Doug, it started with somebody you're very familiar with through your work, and that's Dr. John Carlos, the 1968 Olympian who raised his fist on the medal stand in Mexico City. I wrote John Carlos's memoir with him, and we'd become very close. And a couple years ago, we were hanging out, and John just sort of looked at me and he said, there were so many people who raised their fists at track meets, like high school track meets, after we did it in 1968. And the amateur historian in me, it was like synapses exploding in my brain. Like, what? Who were these people? What happened to them? How did it affect their lives? What were they meaning by doing that? And yet, of course, I faced the reality that, this was over 50 years ago. How am I going to go about finding those folks? But it did make me think really sharply about all of these kind of one-off stories that we'd seen in the media since 2016, where this high school takes a knee, or that middle school takes a knee, this cheerleader took a knee. And I'd written some of those one-off stories and for the nation. And it really got me thinking about, okay, what's the larger context for this? Like, let's look at this holistically. And as I started to do research, I realized, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of young athletes in the United States over the last 4 or 5 years who have felt the Kaepernick effect. People who were upset about police brutality, people who were upset about racial inequity, and what Colin Kaepernick bequeathed to them was a kind of language by which they could express their dissatisfaction. He bequeathed a method by which they could say, oh, that's something I can do. I can take a knee during the national anthem and really protest the gap between what this country can promise and what this country often delivers, particularly to Black and brown communities. So I started thinking about this at the very start of the pandemic. And the pandemic, which has been so awful in so many ways, obviously, actually served a great benefit at this point, because I wanted to track down and talk to a lot of these young people who had taken a knee. And a lot of them were at home at the start of the pandemic, very bored and very happy to talk to me. I mean, my goodness, these are teenagers and early 20-somethings. I have a 17-year-old daughter, and believe me, I have to text her, like, not call. Like, young generation doesn't believe in phone calls, Doug. It's like, I call my daughter.
I understand.
Yeah, I call my daughter. My daughter's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, nothing. I'm just calling to find out when you're coming home. And she goes, oh, I thought it was an emergency. So the phone call is kind of a precious space for a generation younger than us. But this was a different situation because they were home, they were bored, they wanted to talk. And so they really opened up to me all these stories of what happened. And what I quickly figured out was the real story is after they take a knee, not the reason why they took a knee. The real story is kind of like the backlash that they faced, the way their community changed or didn't change. And what I found was that whether we're talking about red states or blue states, rural areas, urban areas, there were obviously great differences, but also some really interesting commonalities in the stories that people told. And so I'm getting all of this information, I'm putting this book together, and then bam, the summer of 2020 happens. And I don't need to tell people who are seeing an audience at the University of Minnesota what I mean by that. Of course, I mean the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. And then what erupts out of that is literally the largest protest in the history of the United States. And I don't think we say that enough. I mean, it hit all 50 states. That had never happened before. And the sheer numbers of people in the streets was unlike anything this country had seen. So I get on the phone and start calling back the dozens of people I'd spoken with just to find out where their heads were at with all this. And what I found, I think without exception, is that they were all either in the streets or organizing people to get in the streets. And these were folks who, when they took a knee, most of them, it was the first political activism they'd ever done in their lives. And here they are in 2020, these confident organizers against racism. And that made me realize that while many roads may have led us to the summer of 2020, one of them runs straight through the playing fields of the United States. And that's really the substance and core of the book.
It's awesome. I think, I'm a sports sociologist myself, and had kind of imagined doing some of the types of interviews you did, but a number of interviews you got, the way you got people to talk to you, how did you get that going? Was it really just kind of automatic or intuitive or organic, or were there things you did in reaching out and finding even how many people to talk to all across the country?
Well, I you know how a baseball player puts the donut around the bat, and it's almost like a cheat code because you're swinging for a while and it feels heavy, and then you get up to the plate and it's a lot easier. Well, my cheat code in doing this book was, and I don't know if this is best practices for doing a book like this, but I put out on social media, and this was before I had a book contract. I just put out, I want to talk to people who kneeled and what happened to them. If you know somebody, or if that's you, the DMs are open. Hit me up. And I got several dozen right off the bat of people who were eager to talk, of people who wanted to share. And that sort of got me in my comfort shoes for how to have these kinds of conversations with people, much younger than myself, people from much different backgrounds than myself. Like it was a very good primer in the kind of cross-generational communication that was so necessary to do the book. So I got in these great conversations, and then some things started to click with me. Like, okay, one of the things I'm learning from the people who were avid to speak with me is that Colin Kaepernick was not the primary motivation for why they did what they did. Colin Kaepernick may have given them the method to do what they did, but the name I heard so much more than Colin Kaepernick was Trayvon Martin, which really forced me to think about how young the people I was speaking with were in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. And speaking to them, it was like hearing civil rights activists from the 50s speak about how it affected them when Emmett Till was killed. It was something that scarred them. Emmett Till, of course, lynched and brutalized in Mississippi. It scarred them in a way that they carried with them through these protests. So I learned that by speaking with them. I also learned that what I said earlier, that the things that they really wanted to engage with and talk about were what happened after the knee. That came from them. That wasn't my questions, and that sort of led me to really formulate and think about, when I started to track people down and speak with them, that this question of the fallout, it was very important to people and very important for them to share. Someone joked with me that I should have called the book "What to Expect When You're Protesting." Like, what to expect when you're expecting, a little joke there. But what to expect when you're protesting, because it's like, imagine you take a knee and you're on a team. What do you do if your coach supports you? What do you do if your coach stabs you in the back? What do you do if your teammates support you? What do you do if they don't want anything to do with you? What do you do if you get death threats? What do you do if you have to lead an assembly? Like, there are all these scenarios that come out of this work that people were very, very eager to discuss.
Let me, I want to come back on the effect. I think that's one of the really interesting, it's in the title. It's because so often we focus on the drama of the protest, and the conflict, and it's really everything that comes out of that I think we want to center on. Before we get to that though, let me ask you, you've got interviews with superstar pro athletes, like awesome interviews with Eric Reed and Michael Bennett and Megan Rapinoe, yet well over 2/3 of the book is college kids and high school students. And that's who you start with, and that's who you really focus on. Can you say a little bit about those choices, especially given that you had access to the kind of superstar athletes that most people kind of focus on and might expect someone to really highlight?
Yeah, I was less interested in speaking actually to Colin Kaepernick, although he knows about the book. I was less interested in speaking to the pros because I really wanted to focus on the effect and also on the stories that aren't told. I mean, because that goes back to the John Carlos telling me about people raising their fist at high school's track meets. Like, I had a real fear that incredible spread of these knee protests at the high school level in particular were going to get memory holed by our society. I mean, we see this in periods of big social upheaval, which I think this current period really does represent. You see, the exhalation and the, political sanding down of someone like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. But they're held up, they're put on postage stamps, but you don't hear about the thousands of grassroots people who actually did the work that created the social context for a King or a Malcolm to emerge. And I could use that example with every social movement. Part of that is that we live in a celebrity culture, no doubt about it, which focuses on the individual. But part of it also, I think very strongly, is that this is the way our society disempowers people. Because if Muhammad Ali, if you think he just came down from Planet Awesome to oppose the Vietnam War, and there was no social context to create a Muhammad Ali, then you start thinking, wow, I could never be like that person up on the pedestal. The best I can do is just genuflect in front of them, instead of seeing yourself as like, I have an active role in creating the kind of world where a Muhammad Ali or a Colin Kaepernick or a WNBA Maya Moore would emerge. And So that's why I wanted to focus on the people who really laid that kind of groundwork. I mean, that was my initial focus. It changed when the protests started in 2020, because then it was like, whoa, like there are a lot of organizers in the streets who trained themselves by doing this kind of athletic protest. But it really comes down to the fear of the memory hole and the fear that these stories would be lost.
So that, and bringing out the agency of regular young people, we often leave out of the story and leave out of the movement. Can I ask you, one of the things that stood out to me, especially I think it was in, well, both the high school and the college chapter, a lot of cheerleaders
Yes.
are focused in the story. Do you want to say a little bit about that decision, and maybe even more so why cheerleaders were so active in taking a knee and all kinds of activist activities in the period?
It was amazing to speak to the cheerleaders as part of this book. And one of the reasons why I did was because when I was doing my research and trying, because, I talked to a lot of people who didn't make it in the book. I read articles about people I didn't get in touch with. So it was very important that the book, for me, at least from my very humble perspective, represented the span of the movement and the actuality of the movement. So things like gender balance were important to me because so many young women took part in this. So you can't write, so I can't like blindly just include stories of football teams, for example, because I would be guilty of actually writing women out of the movement. There were white people who took a knee in solidarity. You mentioned Megan Rapinoe. I didn't want them to be overly hegemonic in the story, but I did want to have their voices in there because they're wrestling with what does it mean to be anti-racist if you're a white person? How do you offer concrete solidarity? And there were some interesting lessons there. And cheerleaders were very much a part of the struggle. So I was like, okay, that needs to be represented, and I need to try to untangle that a little bit. And one of the things that the commonalities with the cheerleaders who took a knee is two things. First, a level of frustration with the football team. Like this idea of, okay, we've got this movement, people are taking a knee, the football team is not acting. And several of them were saying we had solidarity plans for when the football team would take a knee, or we had a meeting with the football team and several of the players said they were going to take a knee, but then it didn't happen. And there are a lot of reasons why we can talk about why that's the case. I mean, first of all, there's the general pressure. I'm not trying to put down the football players. I mean, football can be a very authoritarian sport. It takes a lot of gumption to sort of go out against your coach and do something like that. And also it's very hard for any high school student, quite frankly, or any college student where scholarships can be renewed annually at many institutions. It can be very difficult for them to sort of step out and be seen in that way. And so the cheerleaders, first, there was the frustration with the football players, so they felt like they had to act. And second, there is a culture among the cheerleaders of really seeing themselves as the face of their school. Like seeing themselves as the people who represent the school to an outside audience. So you have a football game, people are coming from the community, people are coming from in town. You're almost like the welcoming committee to the game. And, let's face it, like in many small towns, the football stadium and the Friday night game or a college situation, I mean, that's the closest thing to a community space that we have left in many cities is people going to the football game, people hang out outside, people meet and greet. There's a whole culture around football in this country that I think has grown over the last several decades because of the absence of, I'll put it out there, unions, for example, or, the local Elks Club or things like that, like these institutions that used to define community no longer being there. So a lot of these cheerleaders, they said to me, like, if we're the face of our school and if we're the face of our community and we feel like our community is in serious trouble and we feel like our community is not living up to the standards that we wanted to, then who else but us? We actually have a supreme responsibility to have that knee hit the ground. And I got to tell you, like, Doug, something we haven't mentioned yet, and it just makes me think of this when I think of some of the cheerleaders doing this. What's so exceptionally powerful about the taking of this knee is that when you take a knee, I don't care if you and I, Doug, are at the state fairgrounds or we're at the Super Bowl. If that national anthem plays and we take a knee, everybody immediately knows why we're doing it. there's no mistaking it. Its universality is part of its power, and that's one of the reasons why it's so incredibly feared. I was speaking with one of the people in my book, Mikhail, as part of a meeting we did, and she told a story that
a student here at Minnesota at this point, I think, right? Right,
yeah,
Dave?
you're right. I should have said that, like a student at the U. And one of the things that Mikhail said, which I'd heard from other people, was that when it was clear that her team was going to do something, there was this effort to say, how about you wear protest t-shirts instead? Or how about you wear a sash instead? Like trying to negotiate the knee from happening. And it really is stunning how freaked out people in power are about the thought of that one particular gesture. And I don't think they're freaked out necessarily always because they oppose its aims politically, but freaked out about the reaction that it could cause among alumni, among fans. Like it is an electric thing and something we should reckon with.
Yeah, that's one of those effects. A couple things. I really appreciate you talking us through the cheerleader stuff, because I think it's both a gender story, but also a story about a physical practice that gets overlooked in the sports realm when in fact it's central. So appreciate you doing that. And maybe I was going to wait. Welcome questions. We're already getting some questions in, and there's one that seems relevant to what you were just talking about with the power of taking a knee. Comes from a listener here who says how hard a time they have getting their friends and family that don't agree to see this as a respectful gesture. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and we could talk too. I often think about this in comparison to the clenched fist salute from 1968. And it's been kind of surprising and almost astounding to me how much vitriol's against the knee, which seems to me more of a supplicant gesture than the raised fist. And I think you were just getting into that, but it's some of our listeners are thinking about that already and having a hard time of convincing others of the kind of, I mean, they get the power of it, but not necessarily the kind of deep respectfulness of it that some folks see.
It's stunning, and I expect a lot to be written about this. And I mean, this is something that I wrestle with. I mean, first, just so people get the story, which backs up what you're saying, Doug, people might not realize that Colin Kaepernick did not take a knee at first. He sat on a bench behind his teammates, and he did it as really an act of frustration. It was August of 2016. Philando Castile, of course, from this area, as well as Alton Sterling, Terrence Crutcher. I mean, these killings that were caught on tape had gone viral by police. And Colin Kaepernick, like so many others, was frustrated, and he just sat down during the anthem behind his teammates. And even like video we have of him doing this, I mean, it's wild. It looks like grainy security footage. It's because no one was focused on it. He didn't send a tweet that said he was going to do it. There was no press release. And it was one reporter who I interviewed for the book, Steve Weish, who saw what was happening. And Steve, who'd known Colin since college, made a beeline for him, was like, all right, what's going on? Colin told him. And then, the sky came falling down on him. And it was this huge uproar. And then so Colin Kaepernick, he spoke with a former NFL player in Green Beret named Nate Boyer. And they came up together with this idea of taking a knee in front of the teammates instead of sitting behind the teammates for the exact reason you said, because it would be a show of dissent and civil disobedience while at the same time showing respect for the solemnity of the situation. And I think what Colin Kaepernick found out is that if people don't want to hear your message, they're not going to care how the messenger chooses to dress it up. But I think that act of taking the knee, I mean, it puts in people's head this idea of rebellion, because in a way that like nothing else, and I think it has to do with frankly, the politics of the National Football League. I could be way wrong about this, Doug, but this is just the way my mind works around this, is that, the NFL is this multi-billion-dollar cultural spectacle. It's the closest thing to a monoculture we have in the United States. It's so incredibly popular relative to other sports. And it also absolutely depends on racial and labor discipline. And the racial discipline is a league that's 70% African-American, and there is not one Black American or Black franchise owner. And that contradiction and the absence of Black coaches, the absence of Black executives is why Michael Bennett, the football player who I wrote a book with, who I interview in the book, he says the NFL is a segregated product, not an integrated product, because it's segregated between those who play and those who stay for decades, just raking in the dough for doing it. So, and that's a contradiction at the heart of the sport. And so that racial and labor discipline and that top-down, very vertical structure of power, Colin Kaepernick upset that dramatically when he took that knee. And I think that's what people who are against the knee intuit. And I think, frankly, a lot of the people who took the knee intuit that as well, is the saying that, like, you know, particularly during that anthem space, is saying, I'm not going to go along and get along with this very political anthem in this very political gesture if I can't deal with the fact that police, as Colin Kaepernick said, are leaving bodies in the streets and getting away with murder.
There's so much in there. I'm trying to stay disciplined here and not let myself get into the details. I think there's a really interesting story, for example, starting back from Kaepernick, of what it means to participate in the ceremonies versus sitting on the sidelines. And participating as a protester is, in a certain sense, an act of respecting the ritual or the ceremony. I mean, this is what I've argued about the '68 Olympics protest. It supercharged the ceremony in a way that people who talk about boycotts or sitting out, they miss the powerful symbolism of sport and how it ties into politics and patriotism and militarism and all those things.
Doug, real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think you just said something really smart that I hadn't factored in, and I just want to underline it. Like, that gesture of sitting during the anthem is a very passive gesture. You know, it's like, I support anybody's right to do that, to be very clear, but it's a gesture of passivity. Like, taking that knee, you know, is a move forward. There's a powerful political aggression to it, because it's saying, I am very tuned in to what's happening right now, and I don't like it. And I think that also gives it a certain power that just sitting does not bring to the table.
I can't help but mention one example from the '60s era. Vince Matthews and Wayne Collett in 1972, who were teammates of Smith and Carlos in '68, had similar ideas about the Black Power situation. And they chose, when they got their medals, not to mount the victory stand ceremony. And they were kicked out too, but they're forgotten because they didn't participate in this ceremony and protest the way that others have to really use this formats. All right, I should move on because we plan to get into the effects a little bit more, and I've got questions coming in on that. So you talked about the effects a little bit. What came out of all this? And I'm wondering if we can kind of flesh that out a little more. And not only, I think, for participants and their lessons, but those who are in these communities who are reacting and responding in different ways. What do we learn? What was changing? What was being affected? And what do we learn from all that?
Well, one of the effects is what was exposed in all of these communities, because one of the things that binds all these stories, whether it's red states, blue states, rural areas, urban areas, is that the gesture of taking the knee is, of course, a nonviolent gesture of civil disobedience. It's exceptionally nonviolent, of course. And yet the response in all these cases is the threat of violence or the actuality of violence. And I think that's really a stunning statement about the character of the United States in this moment, particularly the character of a good portion of white America right now in the United States, which we're seeing in so many different ways, from mask debates to critical race theory. I mean, we can talk about that, but I think this was really exposed with all the people taking a knee because the response was so vicious. It was them saying, there was no let's agree to disagree or let's disagree without being disagreeable or, God forbid, gee, let me hear what you have to say. I'd like to hear the perspective of a 17-year-old about racism, and me as a 50-year-old white dude might have something to learn from a 17-year-old Black woman who's taking a knee in a softball game about why she feels the way she does. There was none of that. You know, there was some of that. I shouldn't say that. But in each case, though, you had, I don't like what you have to say, therefore, I'm going to respond with a violent impulse. And I think that first, it's just very evocative about where we are as a country. But it wasn't all like that, as I hinted. Like in some of these cases, you have like real stories of triumph. Like the whole point of taking the knee, and all of them said this, was to try to impose a conversation on a community that was not willing to have a conversation. And in many of the places, not all of them, that conversation did happen. I mean, it's one of the stories about one athlete in New Orleans who had never before done anything, and then she takes a knee, and in a whirlwind of a situation, she's leading an assembly. And this was Peyton Manning's high school in New Orleans. It's a very predominantly white institution, and she's all of a sudden speaking truth to the entire school, and her teachers are patting her on the back in the hallway, and you'll love this, Doug. And they're calling her Smith and Carlos. They're saying like, hey, it's Tommy Smith. Hey, it's Johnny Carlos. And that's actually another thing I learned in doing the book, and you'll very much appreciate this, Doug, is that very few of the people I spoke with had any extensive knowledge of the rich history of sports and struggle.
I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah, that's interesting.
But yet, after they did it, it was like learning really quickly. Like they started to learn. They had teachers who gave them books or articles. They started Googling and they learned about this rich tradition. And a lot of them said, wow, without even realizing it, I'm now standing on the shoulders of giants.
Let me back up. I want to come back to that. There, a quick question though. You were talking about the kind of politics and the threats of violence. I think I know the answer, but I want to pose it to you. Is this about the politics of sport, or is it about the politics of contemporary America that was really being revealed in these reactions?
I mean, one is so deeply baked into the other. I wouldn't know how to disentangle them, except to say that, there are people who, and many people who go to sports, of course, to escape. And to have someone impose like a political perspective on a space that you don't want to see, that you have sort of set aside for yourself, and say, I don't want to see this. One of the things I've said about the knee from the beginning, because of something that happened with my family, is that the knee has the capacity to sever segregation and puncture privilege. And what I mean by that is that it forces a white audience that has the luxury to not think about police violence and racial inequity to actually have to stare it in the face. And I had someone in my family who was, to be very clear, was transformed by that process. Like somebody who listened to sports radio and not regular radio, someone who was able to live a life without knowing the names Philando Castile and Alton Sterling and Sandra Bland, was able to live blissfully unaware of the viral videos. But when athletes started to do it, well, then it became something that he actually had to reckon with. And he reckoned with it, fortunately, in a positive way. But some people reckoned with it in an extremely negative way. Like, how dare you talk to me about this? And then all the tropes come out, Doug, like why aren't you grateful to be an athlete? Why aren't you, like, the gratitude question is always there, and I think that is something that exposed itself. But one other thing too, because you talked about the Kaepernick effect, and one of my arguments is that just by taking the knee and other people taking the knee, it sort of turns upside down the labor and racial discipline that exists in the sports world. I think that sent shockwaves through the powers that be in the sports world, and I don't think you see things like the loosening up of college rules on name, image, and likeness, for example. I don't think you see the Washington football team change its name. I mean, there are all sorts of little piecemeal reforms that we've seen along the way. Even the Olympics, sort of, they're still clutching Rule 50 with their hands, which prevents protest on the podium, but trying to create like safe spaces for political engagement and things like that. I mean, all of this is a result of the Kaepernick effect.
Yeah, let's dive into that a bit. One note for one of our listeners, just to clarify. So Kaepernick's protest really emerged fall 2016 or late summer, fall 2016. That's when this started. A lot of Dave's interviews are then with athletes and other allies from 16, but it's 17, 18, the years after that. So that's the context of the book. I'm sorry if we weren't quite clear on that.
All right.
I'd also say it's important to think about this movement. We were talking history. I was actually a history major as an undergrad, so soft spot in my heart there. But this movement started well before Kaepernick too.
Right.
You mentioned Travion and a lot of the other folks. I give a shout out to the Minnesota Lynx, a pro team that really did a lot to use their platform. So that's kind of it's a decade long of activism. I'd want everybody to know. Dave's really starts with focusing from Kaepernick in 2016, but then what happens after that? Could you say a little bit more about the sporting establishment? Maybe you were just starting to talk to that. And to me, it seems like there's some sports institutions, there was kind of a backlash. Others were more tolerant, if not supportive. And then there were some that, really stood out and stood up. Are you seeing changes in the sporting establishment with respect to both protests specifically, but politics more generally?
I'll tell you, Doug, I'm seeing a lot of carrot and a lot of stick. The carrot is starting things like social justice committees in the NFL, the NBA, the WNBA, other sports, so athletes who want to be politically active can be. That's a big shift from, the sort of unwritten rule of no politics in sports. It's leagues saying, well, actually, there can be politics in sports, but please, please, please don't disrupt the anthem and do them within the parameters of what we're offering. And there's other carrots as well that have been offered. I mentioned the name, image, and likeness, which is a small reform of a college system that I believe needs massive, massive reform. But then you also have, the changing of the Washington football team name was something to assuage anti-racist, both inside and outside the NFL. And there were more inside in the top ranks than one might think, who saw it as an absolute anachronistic embarrassment for a league that's trying to be forward-looking into the 21st century. But I think at root of it is not these leagues having, the best intention for the world in mind, except for perhaps the WNBA, which we can talk about. But when we're talking about the people at the top in the owner's box, the franchise who run franchises, there is an existential fear in sports that is never discussed on ESPN. And that's that the sports audience is aging. I mean, young generation of people have so many more options for their eyeballs during a given day. And I'm not just talking about TikTok and social media. There's so much that's out there competing for them. And pro sports is concerned that they're going to be left behind as this young generation gets older. And the audiences for all the pro sports are aging relative to where they've been in generations past. So that's a real fear. And they also realize, they're in big rooms on Madison Avenue doing focus group stuff, and they're well aware that they're trying to attract a generation that is more demographically diverse than any generation in the history of the United States, and also less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. And they're trying to figure out how to attract them. And yet I see this also as being like 100 miles wide and only an inch deep, because Colin Kaepernick, still no job. Eric Reed, who I interviewed for the book, no job. Actual diversity in the executive ranks, not happening. Actual diversity in franchise ownership, where is it? So you still have like the power structure is trying to preserve itself while also becoming more amenable and to absorb the dissent that's been created over the last 4 or 5 years. Will they be successful in this? Well, I think they've already partially been successful. But I think one of the things that they're doing, that they're playing a very dangerous game with, is once you legitimize the idea of athletes being political, it opens all kinds of other doors. And that's going to be one of the fun things over the next several years, is to see what doors actually do get opened over in the next time ahead of us.
Dave, while you were talking, we got a question in from, I think you'll recognize the name, Cherokee Washington.
Hey,
someone you interviewed, right?
Hey Cherokee, I'm so thrilled you're listening into this. That's amazing.
Cherokee was thinking along the same lines you about the future of protest in sport, reflecting on the IOC's Rule 50, how coaches in colleges relate to activism. I want to throw something at you that I think about a lot, and especially it has a racial angle, that the sports world draws a lot of its legitimacy from its claims to being kind of progressive, idealistic, especially with respect to race. And I know you've written critically, as have I, about the history of that. But I think we don't want to dismiss it out of hand. The contributions that sport has made over the century. I guess the question, let me make it as an observation. When I think about the sporting establishment, I think the sporting establishment still makes those claims a lot, but it strikes me that they're relying more and more on our athletes and our young people to be the legitimators of those claims, the carriers of those claims, the real conscience of the sports world. And I guess I really see that, like with whether it's Rule 50 with the IOC or with our colleges and universities. It's like they're not saying no, but all the onus for activism and idealism seems to be on our youngest and maybe most vulnerable athletes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about, to me, the difference between rebellion and a kind of political philanthropy, for lack of a better term. I mean, are they pushing back against the agenda of the sports world, or are they part of facilitating that agenda in the sports world? And you'll see it come up in different ways at different times. And then we have to be able to follow that closely. And I think the ability to critically judge each of these instances is really interesting. And they're playing with fire by doing this. And one example I'll just throw out at you, Doug, and this is going to be more than a little controversial, but I'm going to throw it out just because it's a concrete example, is the story that raged over the weekend about a group of NBA players trying to really push the union to not require vaccinations. Now, the league should have mandatory vaccinations. That's what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar thinks. That's what I think. That's in the best interest of community health. It's in the best interest of solidarity. But one of the great contradictions of being a pro athlete, and I was just tweeting about this, but one of the great contradictions is that you benefit from organizing collectively as a union, or if you're fighting against racism, but you're also in this hyper individualistic mindset where you compete for jobs, you have individual contracts. And so sometimes that can lead to a kind of negation of solidarity, where you're very, very much looking out for yourself. And, when you factor in the I think well-earned mistrust of the United States and the big pharma about this stuff, I mean, that's the ground by which conspiracy theories can grow. And this is going very against what the league wants. But once you start saying we're providing a space for people to be themselves and talk about politics, well, maybe it's not always going to be the politics you want to hear. And maybe it's really going to go against some of the things you're trying to do. And, I'm one of those people who's like, let it be messy. Let's have the debates. If you're anti-vaccination, like, let's not let that go. Let's debate it. Let's talk about it, because I feel like these debates are always a reflection of what's going on in the larger society. And we're not going to win these debates by bigfooting people. We're going to win them by actually having the kinds of discussions that you facilitate at the U, like this. And that's the whole point of this series. It's like there has to be a back and forth. And I think sports can do a really good job of facilitating that if we use it the right way.
So we've been thinking forward. We got a couple questions coming in, probably asking us for a little more historical context. Somebody's asked, do you remember Tony Smith from Manhattanville College in 2003? I could give you some other names, but maybe using that as a springboard, Dave, we could return to the motivation and inspiration of this generation of protesters, because we did go through a long period of many, many decades where athletes weren't particularly activists. They might have been conscious, but they didn't display that in the same way. And you've written about that history. Do you want to maybe say a little bit about a little bit of the historical context, a couple decades leading up to where we're at now, what things were like, especially for those who aren't big sports fans and followers and maybe don't realize just how amazing and unprecedented the activism that we're seeing in the sports realm is right now?
Sure. I just did a panel with Tony Smith-Thompson. And she's amazing. I mean, this is somebody who was a college student at Manhattanville, a very small school, turned her back to the flag in protest of both the war in Iraq and racism in the United States. And things got very, very dangerous for her as the story went national. And it really says something, though, that she was alone on an island when she did that it wasn't replicated at other levels of the sports world. I mean, you had Carlos Delgado of the Toronto Blue Jays, who didn't come out for the 7th inning stretch out of protest of what was happening in Vieques at the time, which was the use of U.S. military munitions that was really about training for the war in Iraq. But there were not a lot of instances. But if you want to go even broader than that, I mean, if we're going back decades, like post I would say the women's movement in the 1970s and how that was connected with sports, which was really significant. If you push onward from that, it's very difficult to find athletes at the height of sports who were willing to step out and be political. And the ones who were, people like Craig Hodges in the NBA, who in 1991 attempted to get Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan to boycott the NBA finals because of police violence and police brutality, and who did other amazing stuff. Like, we talk about Craig Hodges the whole time, but Craig Hodges found himself bounced out of the league. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, 1996, would not come out for the anthem because he said he believed that the flag was a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others. In his words, he found himself bounced out of the league, and they became like these ghost stories, these individual athletes who were politically conscious. And this is part of the reason why you didn't see more political athletes. I mean, people say, oh, it was the money or whatever. I think it's much more because these athletes were then turned into these ghost stories who were used by management to say, you better not step out of line, you better not be political, because if you are, you could be like Craig Hodges. You could be like Abdul-Rauf, and I think they're trying to do the same with Colin Kaepernick right now, by the way, in the NFL. It's like, don't be political or else, we will bounce you from this league and you'll be done. Everything you've worked your whole life for, a chance to set your family up, you are done. But I think you start to see a big shift with the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really with the killing and stalking and murdering of Trayvon Martin. That's when you start to see a shift, and you start to see a shift for one very important reason that gets forgotten, and one reason that I think is very obvious that we overlook. So we have an obvious reason that we overlook for why things changed, and we have an unknown reason why things changed. So let me just say real quick. So after Trayvon Martin was stalked and murdered by George Zimmerman, people might remember that George Zimmerman was just not being arrested. Like, it just wasn't happening. And you started to have walkouts in high schools all throughout South Florida for Trayvon Martin. And I mean, by one count, I read 56 different schools had walkouts. I mean, that's incredible. And so the news of that filtered to the Miami Heat, where LeBron James was playing. And LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, they posed with their team with hoodies on, and that in this 2012. And that was really the first viral sports and politics photograph. And I think it had LeBron James, who from when he was a teenager said his dream was to be a global icon like Muhammad Ali. I think that at that point, which was almost 10 years into his NBA career, he kind of had his own eureka moment about being able to.
That was with the clenched fist gesture too, right? That was kind of hearkening back to a tradition of activism.
Carlos, yeah. And an awareness about that. And I think that LeBron James, people can have criticisms of him, and I understand them, what have you, about this or that. But the thing about LeBron that's so important is that as the most generationally famous athlete in his sport, he was able to literally bend the league to his desire for athletes to be able to have political space. And it coincided incredibly fortuitously with the NBA commissioner, David Stern, who was very autocratic, stepping down and having somebody a little more laissez-faire in Adam Silver becoming the commissioner. I mean, it's been LeBron's league more than it's been Adam Silver's since 2012. And it's provided like a force field for a lot of other athletes to feel like they can step forward without being punished.
LeBron's league, both on the court and off the court, right? So, I mean, it's just so massive, his influence at all levels. Yeah. And what I hear you saying here too is it's really hard to imagine the activism of athletes outside the larger activism of Black Lives Matter, which I think is really important, because I think that athletes in the 90s and 2000s got a bad rap for not having consciousness when probably what they lacked was opportunity. and support
Exactly.
and context.
And social media has been such a game changer. I just interviewed Olden Polynice, who people might remember. He played in the NBA for a ton of years, and he's of Haitian descent. And I do a radio show with another former NBA player, Etan Thomas, and we interviewed Olden Polynice about what's happening at the border with the Haitian asylum seekers. And Olden Polynice is so sharp. He had so many interesting things to say. But one of the things we talked about was in the early 90s, when Olden was still in the NBA, Bill Clinton reneged on a campaign promise to allow asylum for HIV-positive Haitian refugees. And there were protests around the United States and hunger strikes on campuses around the United States. And Olden Polynice did an in-season hunger strike. Nobody remembers this. He did
I had forgotten that. That's amazing to be reminded.
Playing in the NBA and not eating in protest. And he got no support from the media. If anything, what he got was just people dumping on him for being selfish, for bringing politics into sports, for all the things that you can imagine. Just the worst stereotypes of how the media responds to this stuff was all dumped on Olden Polynice's head. Now imagine for a second if that was Olden Polynice trying to create an opportunity for himself. Imagine if that happened today. Imagine the social media campaign in support of Olden Polynice. Imagine all the reporters trying to look like they're, hip and up to date and following the lead of what would be happening on social media. I mean, it's really been a game changer because we have a sports media in this country that is still, the latest stats just came out, is very old, very white, and very out of touch.
Just had a great question come in from a audience member, Dave, who wants you to, what's your message to young white athletes and white folks in general about their role in this struggle for justice? And that's pretty much of a direct quote.
Yeah. Before I ask, I've been meaning to do this the last three questions. I just want to say again how thrilled I am that Cherokee Washington is on this. Cherokee, you honor the book. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I'm very, very, very grateful. I let the white athletes in the book, one of the things, if you read it, you'll see very quickly, is that my voice is not centered in this at all. Like, I'm centering the voices of the people who had the courage to step out and do this. It's their book, as much or more so than my own. And there, I interviewed several white athletes about what they did. And I think what they did is a good blueprint for what you can do. I mean, first and foremost, if you're upset about racism, join the club. First and foremost, talk to your Black teammates. Tell them that you're interested in protesting. Put no obligations on them to join you, but definitely let people know that this is where your head is at and what you feel like needs to be done. You'll probably find that several of them are going to be like, yes, let's do it. And the Black athletes I spoke with said, we want more white athletes doing this because it takes the weight off of our shoulders and actually provides a degree of protection when they try to go after us as individual Black athletes. I mean, it's a total like I am Spartacus moment where people need to be able to step up and say, I am going to assert myself. I'm going to actually assert my own privilege in this situation to take the weight off my Black teammates and express this very, very basic human idea, which is that nobody should be killed by the police and left to die in the streets.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a tricky, tough question, because I get this a lot from white folks and even like friends and family, not just when I'm doing interviews, but just people in my life who say they're supportive of the cause, but really just don't believe sports is the right place. And it's really hard for them to kind of accept that. It just cuts against their visions of sports and rituals. And I think there's different ways to think about that. Some of them is kind of a high culture thing. Some it's because it's entertainment. But what's your thinking in response on that? And I guess I'm asking about that, especially because we just mentioned white folks and how they can be involved, but then also where there's resistance and hesitance, especially about athletic activism, protest in the sports arena.
I mean, there are two ways to answer that question. The first, if they're really willing to talk and have a conversation about it, I mean, the ability to say to them that sports has always been political. It's baked into the cake of sports. When sports start in the 19th century in this country, it's built on this culture of the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. You know, the myth of inclusion being them saying we're a meritocracy, anybody who's good enough can play. And then the reality of exclusion, whether you're talking about women, whether you're talking about people of color. So the whole history of sports is this fight for access. So it's always been a political space. When you couple that with the post 9/11 world, as Howard Bryant writes so convincingly in his book, The Heritage, post 9/11 hyper politicized that anthem space in a way that makes responding with a political statement of, wait a minute, I'm celebrating this country at a time when people are dying in the streets and police are getting away with murder. I mean, that was something that just would not be abided and could not be abided by a lot of athletes who, because of a financial partnership with the Pentagon and the National Football League, had to come out for this ritual before every game. So that's part of it, is explaining the politics of it. The other part is just to simply quote John Carlos, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but basically he said, if I'm good enough to watch perform, then I'm good enough for you to hear what I have to say. I'm not a robot. If you want to go cheer for robots, find a way to do that. And I think that's part of it too, is when we say athletes can't be political, and I want to be very clear, athletes also have the right to not be political. You know, the point is to not make it so people have signed away their right to be fully human, fully have full citizenship, basically, if they are an athlete. And that it actually is a good thing, because athletes are role models, whether we want them to be or not. You know, the old expression, you don't have to believe in gravity. If you fall out of an airplane, you're going to fall. You know, athletes are role models. And wouldn't we rather them model being politically engaged with the world than just about anything else?
Great thoughts. I got to be honest, I've got an amazing audience here. We just had like 6 questions, great questions come in. We've only got like 2 or 3 minutes left. So I'll just tell you the topics, but then there is one I want to ask you about specifically. There are questions about violence and radicalism in protests, about impacts on the criminal justice system, about which sports are the most radical or least. But Dave, can I ask you about sports media? Because I think, to me, when I think about effects, one of the things that's changed the most dramatically in the last few years is the way that sports reporters relate to social issues, social changes, protest politics, etc. And you sit right at the middle of that, where you started, when you started your career, where you started it, and what you're doing now. Could you just take a minute or two to tell us what you've seen with respect to sports media on just covering these kinds of issues and the athletes' concerns?
Yeah, the specter of protest over the last 10 years has profoundly changed the sports media landscape. Like now, if it used to be when I started, if you were saying anything about society, about culture, and connecting that with sports, I mean, unless you were willing to do it in a really, really sort of dumbed down way, like let me explain to you how the Karate Kid explains today's NBA, you know, unless you were doing it like that, you were really derided and marginalized and frankly told that there was no room at the inn. In other words, there's nothing for you to do in the sports world if that's your perspective. That's changed so dramatically in the last 10 years that, like, my good friend Michael Lee, who's always been a political person, but was an NBA beat writer for all sorts of big publications, including the Washington Post for 16, 17 years. He's following around the NBA. Now he's the politics and culture sports writer for the Washington Post. Amazing. They just started another position at the Washington Post for a woman, Candace Buckner, to have a similar role. USA Today has a position that's like that. I mean, this is a remarkable change in the industry. And so I would say to people who want to be sports writers or sports journalists who are listening to this, you got to know more than the X's and O's if you want to make it in today's world. And that's a good thing.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry to see Professor Jacobs back on screen. I think there's a message for us there.
Well, I want to just jump in and thank both of you. That was a terrific conversation and clearly could have gone on for 2 hours.
Yeah.
So I'll have to have Dave Zirin back to talk about his reporting, and my colleague here, Doug Hartmann, who I'm sure will be moderating more programs coming up. Thanks to both of you. It's just terrific.
Thank you, Larry.
I want to just mention some upcoming programs. We've got two programs coming up in October. One is on the growing power of Black and Latinx members of Congress. And we've got a terrific panel, including Michael Minta, Alvin Tillery, and Jamil Scott. Looking forward to that. And then October 27th, we've got a program on the strength and curse of community organizing with one of the legendary community organizers, Marshall Gans. Like all these programs, 12 noon. We've got a program or two coming up with conservatives and Republicans. I'm excited about those as well, and we'll have that information out ASAP. Okay, if you like today's program, you can see it again or share it with other people. It'll be up on YouTube. It'll also be available on podcasts from all your favorite podcast platforms, and can be found by searching on Dialogue Across Difference. And we recommend you just subscribe to our podcasts so you don't miss them, because we're doing a lot of them and they're all, I think, fascinating. If you enjoyed today's program, we'll just give a pitch to consider making a contribution. Small is great, large is greater. These programs are free and open to everybody, and of course, they are costly to do. Once again, I want to give a big shout out to Doug Hartman and to Dave Zirin. This was a great program today. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to all of you who were with us this afternoon.